Drifter found a barefoot bride, walking the trail 2 days after her wedding. The first thing I noticed was the blood. Not a lot of it, just a rust-colored smear on a pale rock shelf where the trail bent around the cedar break, low enough that I almost missed it going by. Cutter slowed without me asking. He'd been doing that for years, reading my silences better than most people read words, and I'd gone quiet the moment I saw it. I sat a moment in the saddle, just listened, whined off the flats steady out of the north, a meadowlark somewhere in the brush to the south, nothing else. No other horses, no human sound. I stepped down and crouched by the rock. The smear was foot-shaped at the heel and narrow across the ball, a woman's foot, or a young boy's. The blood was dry but hadn't cracked yet. Half a day old, maybe 6 hours, maybe 8. I straightened and looked down the trail ahead, open and empty as far as I could see, looked behind me. Same. Looked at the cedar break itself, which ran maybe 80 yards south before it thinned to scrub and then open ground. I started walking that direction with Cutter following loose behind me, reins trailing. She was sitting with her back against a cedar trunk, knees pulled up, watching me come. She didn't run. She didn't call out. She just watched with the careful stillness of a person who had measured every option she had and run out of the good ones. So she was sitting with the bad ones and waiting to see which one arrived first. I stopped about 10 feet away and took my hat off. My mother had beaten that habit into me before I was tall enough to argue back. And some things just don't leave a man no matter how long he's been away from the person who put them there. "You all right?" I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Brown eyes, dark circles under them from days without sleep. Her dress was white, had been white, with blue embroidery along the collar and down the sleeves, the careful, slow kind of embroidery a woman only puts on something she's kept set aside for something that matters. The dress was torn at one shoulder and filthy from the knee down, the hem ragged with creek mud. Her feet were bare. The right one had a cut along the arch, not deep, but ragged and red around the edges, the kind of cut that gets worse the more you walk on it. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady, which was the part that surprised me. I looked at her foot. She followed my eyes down to it. "I lost a shoe in the creek," she said. "I threw the other one away so I'd stop limping uneven." I almost smiled. "Didn't. Where are you headed?" "West," she said. "That's a direction, not a destination." She looked at me steadily. "I'm aware of that." I put my hat back on. "Well, I'm headed to Calvary Springs. That's west and it's also a destination. Town's got a doctor and a general store and a woman who runs a boarding house and doesn't ask a lot of questions." I paused, let her think on it. "You're welcome to ride." "I'll walk." She studied me the way a careful woman studies a strange man on a trail, taking in what she can see, measuring what she can't, calculating the odds. I let her look. I understood the math she was doing. A woman alone has to make quick decisions about men, and getting one wrong costs more than she can afford. "Why would you walk?" she said. "Because you've got a cut foot and I've got 2 good ones." I held Cutter's reins out to the side so she could see the whole horse, nothing hidden behind him. "He's gentle. Name's Cutter. Don't worry about the name." She looked at the horse, then at me. Then she put her palm flat on the ground beside her and pushed herself upright, and I saw her try to suppress the wince when her right foot took weight. She didn't ask for help getting to Cutter, and I didn't offer it uninvited. I held the bridle while she took the stirrup and swung up, and she did it with the easy balance of someone raised around horses, not a woman who'd learned riding as a skill, but one who'd grown up with it. She settled in the saddle and looked down at me, and I started walking. We didn't talk for a while. That was fine. I've never been a man who needed the quiet filled up, and she didn't seem to need it either. She rode and I walked, and Cutter set an easy pace, and the morning burned off and the day came into itself. The light going hard and direct, the scrub brush casting thin shadows. After about a mile she said, "My name is Clara Holt." She paused, started again. "Clara Birch, I suppose." As of 2 days ago. I thought on that. Holt by preference or by circumstances? Both, she said. We kept moving. The trail was open here with good sight lines in both directions, which I always noted out of long habit. After another half-mile, she said, his name is Garrett Birch. He runs cattle out of Redstone. Big operation, 12-14 hands, maybe more. Quarter section of good grass, water rights on 2 creeks, shares in the Redstone Merchants Bank. She laid it out the way you'd read down a column of figures, flat, no weight in it. My father arranged the match. I met Garrett 4 times before the ceremony. The last time before the wedding, he was very polite. I didn't ask the next question. It wasn't my place, and I figured she'd say what she needed to say in her own order. He hit me the first night, she said, same flat tone. Not in anger exactly, more deliberate than that. The way a man plants a fence post to show where his line will run, just so everything's clear from the start. I kept walking. The ground was dry and gritty, and each step made a small, steady sound. I waited until he was asleep, she said. Then I walked out. In your wedding shoes. In my wedding shoes. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile. They had heels. That turned out to be a poor choice for rough ground. I thought about a woman in a white wedding dress, walking out of a house in the middle of the night in heeled shoes onto rocky trail ground, and not stopping for 2 days. And I kept whatever I thought about that off my face. You have people you can get to, I said. Anyone close? Not near here. My mother's in Abilene. She paused. My father arranged the marriage. Some things a person says by leaving them out. The sun was straight up and hot when we reached the creek, and I was glad for it. I stopped Cutter in the shade of the cottonwood that leaned out over the bank and watered him while Clara stepped down carefully, keeping weight off the right foot. I filled the canteen and passed it to her, and she drank without ceremony, 3 long swallows, and passed it back. I dug in the near saddlebag and came up with the cloth I used for the rifle, about the cleanest thing I owned, which was not saying much, but it was something. I went to the creek and worked it in the water and wrung it most dry and crouched down. Let me look at that foot, I said. She swung down without argument and sat on a flat rock and propped her foot across her knee. The cut was crusted over and the skin around it was starting to redden in a way I didn't like. I cleaned it out careful, working slow, and she didn't make a sound the entire time, which told me something about her that I stored away. I wrapped the cloth around her arch and tied it off. That's not much, I said. It's more than I had, she said. I stood up. My name was Amos Deal, and I'd been drifting through this territory for going on 3 years, working cattle drives when the work was there, doing whatever else when it wasn't. I was 44 years old, which is old enough to have learned certain things and young enough to still be surprised by them occasionally. I had 1 horse, 1 rifle, a saddle that was older than some of the towns I'd ridden through, and enough money in my boot to get me to Calvary Springs and maybe a couple of weeks past it if I was careful. I looked at the trail behind us, long and open, nothing on it. Birch will come after you, I said. Yes, she said. No hesitation, no drama in it. How long before he wires ahead to town, do you think? She thought about it honestly. He'd want to find me himself first. Sending a wire means admitting he lost her, and he has pride about those things. He'd ride the trails first. He'd bring men, he's got hands who do that kind of work. 2 days maybe before he tried the wire if he got that far. She paused. He might not wire at all. He might just ride until he found me. I looked at the trail again. Then at Clara Holt, sitting on a rock with a wrapped foot and a torn white dress and 2 days of hard miles on her, with the particular steadiness of a person who had thought things through very far ahead and had simply been doing what needed doing since. All right, I said, let's move. I didn't put her up alone. I rode and she rode behind me, which was less comfortable for both of us but faster, and she held onto the back of my saddle without being asked. Cutter carried us without complaint. Good horse. Best horse I'd owned in 20 years of owning horses. We made good time in the afternoon. I rode and she rode behind me, her hands on the back of the saddle, and Cutter moved easy under both of us. The trail cut north around a long bluff, the rock face striped orange and rust in the late light, and then came down through a broad draw toward the flat approach to Calvary Springs. You could see the town from about 5 miles out. The water tower first, then the church steeple, then the darker mass of rooftops spreading out below. It looked small from that distance, which towns always do, but I'd learned not to mistake small for simple. Towns carry a lot of complicated life inside their few blocks. I kept one eye on the ground behind us the whole way in. Not obvious about it, just the regular rear check of a man who's traveled enough to know that what's behind you matters as much as what's ahead. Clara seemed to notice and started doing the same without being told to. The back of my neck eased a little when I saw that. A person who checks their back without being reminded is a person thinking about more than the immediate moment. And in our situation, the immediate moment was not the only thing I was worried about. We saw no one on the trail. The ground behind us stayed empty all the way to the edge of town. We came in at dusk, which was the right time to come in when you'd rather not be studied. The main street ran maybe 200 yards with buildings on both sides, a general store, a hardware outfit, a hotel, 2 saloons, and the variety of other things a working town accumulates. The population had the look of people who had learned by experience that minding their own business was usually the better choice. I had come through once before, 3 years back, and the bones hadn't changed. Ida Marsh's boarding house sat near the east end, a 2-story frame building with clean windows and a painted sign that said ROOMS. I helped Clara down from the saddle. The cloth wrapping on her foot was dark with trail dust, and she winced when her feet touched ground, but she bore her own weight. Ida answered the door herself. A woman of 60 or so, iron-gray hair, the manner of someone who had heard every story a door could bring and stored them all without drama. She looked at Clara, then at me, then at Clara's foot. She took it all in about 3 seconds. "Back room," she said, "quieter there." She took Clara inside. I stood on the porch a moment, listening to the town. Then I took Cutter to the livery at the other end of the street, paid 2 days in advance, watched him get settled with his grain, and walked back through the dark. The front room had 4 chairs, a lamp, and a braided rug that had been good 10 years ago. I sat in the chair nearest the lamp, and I thought about what I had done, and what I was doing, and whether those were decisions or whether they'd made themselves, and I'd simply been walking alongside them. I was a man without fixed address. I had no land, no woman, no arrangement with anyone anywhere. There was a drive north I'd been planning to make, a herd staging in about 3 weeks, and I'd intended to arrive early and pick up good work before the spots filled. That had been my plan. Clara came down after a while. She'd washed and changed into a plain dress Ida had lent her, gray wool, a little long in the hem. The white dress was gone. I didn't ask after it. She sat down across from me and looked at me directly. "I don't have any money," she said. "I walked out with nothing. I want you to know that. I can work, I can cook and sew, and I'm good with figures, but right now I have nothing to pay you with for what you did today." "I didn't do it for payment," I said. "I know that," she said. "That's why I'm telling you, because you deserve to know it clearly." From the kitchen came the sound of Ida at the stove. "What will you do?" she said. "Tomorrow." "I thought I'd stay a few days," I said. "Make sure you get settled and the doctor sees that foot." I paused. "Make sure Birch doesn't ride in and give you trouble if he comes." She looked at me for a long moment. "That's not a small thing." "It's not a large one either," I said, which wasn't entirely honest, and I think she knew it. "Why?" she said. She asked it simply, not a challenge, just a genuine question from a person who wanted to understand something. I sat with it. There were several ways to answer. The most honest one went something like this. I had come around a cedar break and seen a woman who had walked barefoot for 2 days in a torn wedding dress rather than stay one more night in a house where a man had made his intentions plain. And something in me had made a decision before I'd consciously made it, and I was old enough to recognize when a decision had already been made. I had nowhere important to be, I said. She looked at me another moment. Then she said, "I'm going to sleep now, Mr. Deal, thank you." She went upstairs and I sat in Ida's front room and listened to the town going quiet. It took a while. A town doesn't go quiet all at once. It does it in stages. The saloon, a block over, was the last thing I could hear, its sound coming and going with the wind, and then sometime past 10 even that faded down to nothing I could make out from where I sat. The lamp oil ran out and the room went dark, and I stayed in the chair anyway in the dark, because there wasn't anywhere I needed to be. I had sat in a lot of chairs in a lot of rooms over the years. Most of them were interchangeable, the same transaction of a man needing somewhere to sleep and a room offering itself, nothing more. This one felt different, though I couldn't have told you exactly why. Maybe it was the rug. Maybe it was the sound of Ida still moving somewhere at the back of the house, the small sounds of a person who lived in a place and was simply present in it. Maybe it was something else. I went to my room around 11 and slept better than I had in a month. In the morning, I had coffee in the kitchen with Ida, who was up before light and who made strong coffee and offered none of the commentary a lot of people offer over morning coffee. She just made it and set it in front of me and went back to what she was doing. I thought she was probably a woman I would have liked even if I hadn't needed her help, which is the best thing you can say about a person you've just met. Clara came down around 7. She'd slept and it showed. She moved differently than she had the night before, with something more of herself in it, like a person who had been running on nerve for several days and had finally got to let the nerve rest. She poured her coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the alley, which was just lightening up to gray. "The doctor's office is on the main street," she said, to no one in particular. "2 doors down from the general store," Ida said. "He starts seeing people at 8. Clara nodded. She turned the cup in her hands and looked at it. "I'll go this morning," she said. After breakfast, I went to the livery to check on Cutter. Garrett Birch arrived an hour later. I was at the livery checking Cutter's near foreleg, which had felt a little warm the night before, when I heard the horses, 4 of them, coming in from the south, moving fast and then pulling up short on the main street. I didn't hurry out. I finished what I was doing, pulled on my coat, checked the rifle without making a production of it, and then walked out easy. Birch wasn't what I'd built in my head, which was my own fault for building anything. He was younger than me by a good 10 years, maybe 35, and built big, the kind of big that comes from physical work combined with always having enough to eat and never being told to back down. He had 3 riders with him, men on good horses with the relaxed posture of people who were paid to handle situations and were used to handling them. Birch himself was standing in the street talking to the man who ran the hardware store, asking something, his manner polite enough on the surface with something harder underneath it. I walked toward him, not fast, just walked like a man going somewhere. He saw me at about 40 yards and waited, which told me he was smarter than he looked. He tracked me coming with the particular attention of a man who reads other men quickly, calculating distances and angles, working out what I was before I got there. I stopped 10 feet away. "You know where my wife is," he said it like a statement he was briefly making into a question. "No," I said. He studied me. "You came in last night. Livery man says you had a woman riding with you." "I gave a woman a ride," I said. "She needed to get to town. I don't know where she ended up." All of that was technically true, and I held his eyes while I said it. He said, "You're lying." "I'm not," I said. There was a pause long enough that the hardware man found a reason to go back inside his store. A woman who had been crossing the street at the far end had stopped moving. Birch looked at his riders, looked back at me. He was calculating something, whether this was worth the public trouble in a strange town, whether I was the kind of man worth pushing, what it would look like. He was proud, and a certain kind of pride makes a man careful about where he spends it. "She is my wife," he said, "under the law of this territory." "The law in this town," I said, "is Sheriff Tanner. He's a careful man about how things are done in his jurisdiction. I'd go see him before doing anything on your own." I was guessing about Tanner. I had met him once, years back, and had a memory of a deliberate man who kept things orderly. That was all I had to work with. Birch held my eyes another moment. The street was very quiet. One of his riders shifted in the saddle and the leather creaked. I did not move. Then Birch looked away, just to the side, just for a second, but that was enough. He said something low to the man nearest him, too quiet for me to hear, and the four of them wheeled their horses and rode to the hotel at the other end of the street. Unhurried, like men who hadn't been moved, just redirected. Birch had a particular skill for moving without looking like he'd been made to move. I watched them go until they were inside and the hotel door had closed behind them. Then I walked into the livery and stood with my back against the wall in the shade and let out a long breath and gave my hands about 10 seconds to stop wanting to make fists. My heart was running faster than I'd let show. I stood there until it wasn't. A man named Connell ran the livery, and he was doing something with a harness at the back of the building, and he hadn't moved or looked up through any of that, which was exactly the right thing to do, and I appreciated it. I found Tanner at his office. He was a lean man in his late 50s with a methodical manner, and the kind of eyes that had seen enough versions of every situation to stay level through most of them. He was writing at his desk when I came in, and he put the pen down and gave me his full attention without making me feel I was taking up time he'd rather spend differently. I told him the situation straight, what Clara had told me on the trail, the condition she'd been in when I found her, Birch in town now with 3 men. He listened to all of it without interrupting once, which was more than most men managed. "Birch," he said when I finished. "You know him." "Know of him. Runs cattle out of Redstone. Big outfit." He thought about it with the deliberate quality of a man who had learned to think before he spoke. "What she's describing, the husband has legal standing to require her return. That's how the law sits right now in this territory." "What I'm describing," I said, "is a woman who walked out barefoot in the dark rather than stay one night in that house, and a foot that was going bad from infection when I found her 2 days later." He looked at me steadily. "Is there anything I can put in front of a judge, something I can document, not someone's account of a private incident, something physical, something visible?" "That's what I need to go find out," I said. I went to Ida's. Clara was in the kitchen with Ida, working bread dough, and the kitchen smelled like yeast and warmth. I sat down at the table and kept my voice level. "Birch is at the hotel," I said. "He came in this morning with 3 men. The sheriff is willing to move on this, but he needs something he can document, something a judge can look at, not your account of what happened, something physical." She stopped working the dough. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up to the collar of the borrowed dress and drew it off her right shoulder. The bruise covered her upper arm and wrapped onto the shoulder blade. It had gone yellow-green at the edges, which put it at 5 or 6 days old, which put it at the first night. It was made by a hand. You could see the finger marks if you looked, and I looked long enough to know what I was seeing and not longer. Ida Marsh, who had been standing at the stove, turned and looked. She turned back to the stove and was very quiet. "There's the lip too," Clara said. She touched the corner of her mouth. "It's mostly healed over, but the sheriff can probably still see it." "All right," I said. "He'll want to come here today." Tanner came within the hour. He sat at Ida's kitchen table with a small notebook, and he looked at the shoulder and the lip, and he wrote for a couple of minutes without saying anything. Then he put the notebook away and told Clara she was to stay at Ida's while he had a conversation with Birch. He glanced at me when he stood up. "You'll be around." "I'll be around," I said. He went. Ida made coffee. Clara and I sat at the kitchen table, and the clock on the wall counted off the minutes. There are certain kinds of waiting that are harder than action, and this was one of them. The particular difficulty of sitting still when the thing that matters most is happening somewhere else, and all you can do is be present and ready in case it comes back to you wrong. Clara's hands were flat on the table. She was watching the door. I was watching the window that faced the main street, which gave me a slant view of the hotel where Birch was staying and a partial view of the sheriff's office down the block. I didn't see anything useful in that window for over an hour. I just watched it anyway. Mrs. Farlow came through at some point and poured herself coffee and looked at the two of us and went back upstairs without saying anything, which I appreciated. Ida moved quietly around the kitchen doing things that didn't need to be done, but gave her hands something to work with. The clock said 11:15, and then 11:40, and then noon, and then quarter past. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much that needed saying until there was something to say. Just before 1 o'clock, I saw Tanner crossing the main street toward the boarding house. I watched the way he walked, steady, not urgent, not the walk of a man coming to deliver bad news. Some of the tightness went out of my shoulders that I hadn't been tracking. He came in and sat down across from Clara, and he told her everything in the plain way he had, that Birch had agreed to a legal separation proceeding, had agreed not to return to Calvary Springs, had agreed to send Clara's personal belongings from the Redstone Ranch within 10 days. He said he had made certain things clear to Birch about the consequences of failing to honor any of those agreements, and his tone when he said it was the tone of a man who had made those things very clear indeed, and had not needed to say them twice. He looked at me at the end of it, not long, just a look that acknowledged I'd been useful and that he had no further need of me, which was all I wanted from him. Clara said thank you in a voice that was very controlled. Tanner left. Ida found something to do in the other room. Clara put her face in her hands. Not for long, maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. Not crying, I was pretty sure. Just the particular stillness of a person taking the first breath they've had room for in several days, a breath that goes all the way down. Then her hands came flat on the table again and she looked up at me. "Thank you," she said. It came out different from the first time she'd said it, heavier somehow and more certain. "You did the hard part," I said. "You walked out." "Barefoot," she said. "Barefoot," I agreed. And that was when she finally almost smiled, just at the corner of her mouth, barely there, but real. That evening she came down the stairs with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of me and sat down across the table with the other. The lamp was low, the oil down near the bottom of the reservoir, and the light it made was warm and close and threw long shadows up the walls. Outside, the town was settling into its evening, the distant sound of the saloon a block over, a wagon going slow on the main street, the ordinary noise of a place living its life. We drank coffee and sat without talking much, and the silence was different from the silences we'd had on the trail. Those had been careful silences, people measuring what was safe to say. This one had something easier in it. Something had been resolved that morning that had been unresolved before, and whatever it was, its absence changed the quality of the air between us. She had her hands wrapped around the cup the way you hold something warm when you're glad to have warmth available. She was looking at the lamp. After a while she said, "What are your plans, Mr. Deal, going forward?" "Amos," I said. She looked at me. "Amos." She said it the way you say a thing you're trying the weight of. "What are your plans?" "I had a drive in mind," I said. "North. Heard staging in a few weeks. I'd meant to get up there early and sign on before the good spots filled." "And after that drive?" Another one, or something else. I looked at the lamp the same way she had been. That's how it's gone the last few years. She turned the cup in her hands. She had capable hands, not rough from abuse, but the kind that had done real work and were easy with it. Is it a good life, she said, moving like that? I sat with the question honestly. Parts of it are, I said. Parts of it aren't. It suits a man who doesn't have much to come back to in any one place. Less of a sacrifice to keep moving when you haven't put down anything that needs you to stay. She was quiet a while. I drank some coffee. Then she said, "You could have kept riding yesterday. When you saw the blood on the rock, most men on that trail at that hour would have kept going." Most men did keep going, I said. I didn't. She nodded slowly. Not like she needed convincing, more like she was filing something away. "I'm glad you didn't," she said. She said it plain, without theater, and turned back to the lamp. Outside, someone was closing up a shop, the sound of a door, a lock turning, footsteps on wooden boards going away. The lamp threw its warm circle and we sat inside it and drank coffee, and for the first time in a while I was somewhere. I didn't feel the need to calculate how soon I'd be leaving. I stayed in Calvary Springs. I didn't decide to exactly. Or rather, I kept deciding I'd leave and then not leaving until enough time had gone by that the pattern was the decision. 3 weeks went by, then 6. I stopped counting in weeks sometime around the 8th one. I took a room at Ida's. Room at the back, small, with one window that looked onto the alley, and let in a stripe of morning light that moved across the floor as the sun moved, and told you what time it was without having to look at a clock. I paid for the room and work. Ida always had something that needed doing, and with the small wages from the jobs I picked up around town. It was the first time in 3 years I had a room I paid for myself instead of a bedroll under stars, and I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I had missed having a room. The work wasn't hard to find. A town of Calvary Springs size always has a list of deferred maintenance. The church roof had been soft in one corner for 2 seasons, and I spent 3 days on it. A rancher named Pollard, a mile south, needed half his fence line relocated because a spring flood had cut a new channel and moved his property boundary, and I spent a week on that. I took 2 short day rides with other hands when someone needed an extra man for a cutting or to move a small herd. It wasn't cattle drive money, but it was enough, and I had somewhere to come back to. The drive north staged in early November and left without me. I was in town when it went. I watched the string of horses and riders pass through on their way to the staging grounds, and I felt nothing much. A faint pull, maybe, the way you feel a pull towards something that used to be the direction you went in, but not enough to move. Clara had taken on the boarding house accounts within her first week. Ida handed them over with what I recognized as genuine relief. Ida ran a good house, but her relationship with figures was approximate at best. Clara had a quick, organized mind for numbers, the kind that could hold several things at once without losing track of any of them. She found a discrepancy in Ida's ledger within 3 days, a supplier who had been overcharging for lamp oil by a small amount per delivery, enough that it didn't show on any single transaction but added up to something real over the course of a year. She brought it to Ida quietly, with the documentation laid out plain. Ida went to the supplier and the problem was corrected. I happened to be in the kitchen when Ida told her what the supplier had said. He'd claimed it was an honest error, and Clara said, without particular heat, that an honest error that always fell in his favor for 12 consecutive months was interesting arithmetic. Ida laughed, which was not a sound I had heard from her before. It turned out Ida had a laugh like a gate hinge that needed oiling, and it was one of the better sounds in the boarding house. Clara learned the names and particulars of the 4 boarders within days. Mr. Hennessy, who was a land surveyor working a contract east of town, and who wanted hot coffee and no conversation before 8 in the morning. Mrs. Farlow, a widow of 70 who'd come to live near her son, and whose son turned out to have less room and patience than she'd expected, and who had a hip that pained her in the cold. 2 young brothers named Dawes who were working the lumber operation that had started up 5 miles west, and who ate enormous amounts and were cheerful about it. Clara knew all of them within a week and adjusted accordingly. Hennessy's coffee ready early, Mrs. Farlow's chair moved closer to the stove, extra bread on the table on the nights the Dawes brothers were in. She cooked 3 nights a week when Ida's other cook, a woman named Pearl, was off. Her cooking was honest, plain and good, and made from what was in front of her, without performance. She made a venison stew in October that I thought about for days afterward, not because it was fancy, but because there was nothing wrong with it. Every element was what it was supposed to be, and no element was absent. She wrote her mother in Abilene. She found a lawyer through Ida's network of acquaintances, 2 letters away from the man her mother already knew, which saved time and money both. The legal business moved forward the way legal business always moves, slowly and with paperwork, each step requiring the previous step to be fully completed before it could begin, and each step taking longer than you expected. She dealt with each piece when it came and didn't waste energy on the pieces that hadn't arrived yet. I watched all of this from a useful distance, which is the right distance for watching something that matters to you when you haven't fully worked out what it means. One afternoon in October, she came out to the linta behind the boarding house where I was splitting wood. Splitting wood is what I do when I have time and nothing particular to fill it with. It's honest work. It doesn't require thinking, and at the end of it, there's something solid to show for the time. I was splitting and stacking when she came out and leaned against the post and watched me. I kept working. She waited with the ease of a person who has learned not to fill every quiet moment. After a while she said, "The legal matter with Garrett is moving. My mother's lawyer has been in contact with the county clerk. There should be a formal separation decreed by winter, and then after that, she let that go unfinished. It takes time." "It does," I said, "but it'll get done." "Yes," she said. She watched me set up another piece and split it. "I want to say something to you clearly, so there's no confusion about it." I set the axe down and looked at her. "I'm not looking to trade one arrangement for another," she said. "I didn't walk out of that house so I could walk straight into another one the same way. I want something that feels like I chose it, not arranged, not fallen into because I ran out of road. Something I actually walked toward." She held my eyes. "I think you've been wondering about my intentions. I thought you deserved to know them plainly." She was right that I'd been wondering. It would have taken a different kind of man not to wonder. "That seems like a fair thing to want," I said. She looked at me a long moment. Then she walked the few steps across the yard and put her hand on my forearm, just flat, resting there, the way you put your hand on something to feel if it's solid and real. She looked up at me. The October light was going long and low, cutting sideways through the yard, making everything it touched look more real than usual. "I know what I want," she said quietly. "I just wanted to say it where you could hear it." She took her hand back and went inside. I stood there with the axe handle in my grip for a long time before I used it. Winter came in hard on the high plains, the way it always does, not gradually but all at once, like the season made a decision and acted on it. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 days, and the wind came down off the north with nothing to stop it for 100 miles. Calvary Springs closed up against it. Shutters tight, extra wood stacked on every porch, the livery full with animals brought in from outlying ranches. I had work enough. There is always something in a winter town for a man who is capable with his hands and doesn't require comfort to function. The first snow came in late November and the second came a week after that, and by December the ground was locked, and the cold was the kind that got into everything, into door hinges and pump handles, and the gaps between boards that nobody had gotten around to caulking. I spent 3 days rebuilding a fireplace on the north end of town, from the firebox up, The old one had a crack in the firebox wall that was sending smoke back into the room instead of up the flue, which is the kind of problem that's been building for years before someone gets serious about it. It was satisfying work. There is a logic to masonry that I've always appreciated. The way each course of brick depends on what came before it and determines what comes next. And when it's done right, you can feel it done right. A solidity that isn't performance. The hardware man's storage shed was leaning about 12 degrees off plumb from the west wind, which had been loading it for 3 seasons. I spent 2 days shoring it up with new sill plates and cross-bracing. He paid me in cash and threw in a pair of good work gloves, which I needed. A widow named Mrs. Alcott on the east end of town had a pump that had given out sometime in October, and she'd been carrying water from the creek in a bucket ever since, which at her age and in that cold was its own kind of suffering. I spent a day on her well. The problem was a cracked cylinder that had to be pulled and replaced, which involved lying face down on the frozen ground for the better part of an hour getting the old one out, which was unpleasant. She paid me in 2 meals and a jar of apple preserves. The meals were good and the apple preserves were outstanding, and I considered it fair. Evenings I was at Ida's. Clara and I had settled into a habit that neither of us had named. She'd come down after dinner. We'd sit in the front room. She'd bring coffee when there was any and not bring it when there wasn't. And we'd talk or not talk in about equal measure. We talked more easily than we had in October. The distance I'd been keeping from my own thinking had been getting shorter without my doing anything about it, the way distances do when you stop watching them. One evening in December, she told me about the house she'd grown up in Abilene. Small, she said, but her mother had kept it feeling bigger than it was through some quality of light and arrangement she couldn't quite describe. Good windows, she thought, and the habit of keeping things where they belonged and not piling more on top. Her mother was a woman who understood that a space didn't have to be large to feel right. It just had to be organized around the people in it. She'd had a horse as a girl, a spotted mare named Boots who died when Clara was 14, and she said she'd cried for 2 solid days, and her father had told her it was only a horse. She said it matter-of-factly, as a piece of information about who her father was, offered without editorial. "What did your mother say?" I asked. "She didn't say anything to my father," Clara said. "She came into my room that night and sat on the edge of the bed and stayed until I was asleep. That was what she did." I thought about that. "That's a good mother," I said. "She is," Clara said. "She's the reason I wrote to her first, and not anyone else." I told her about a ranch I'd worked in my 20s in New Mexico Territory. A good operation, a fair man running it, and I'd stayed 3 years, which had been the longest I'd been anywhere since I was a boy. Good country down there, dry and vast, with mountains to the west that went purple in the evening and were something to look at. I'd learned cattle work properly on that ranch, not just the labor of it but the thinking behind it, how you managed a herd through seasons, how you read range grass, how you made decisions about breeding stock. It was real knowledge, and I'd used it for 20 years since. "Why'd you leave?" she said. "The man sold. New owner had his own crew and no use for holdovers." I turned the cup in my hands, and I hadn't put anything down there. I'd been working someone else's operation and keeping myself easy to move, the way you do when you don't have anything of your own that needs you to stay. When the reason to stay went away, I went too, and I told myself that was fine. I paused. The leaving gets easy. Gets easier every time you do it until it's just the habit of you, and you stop noticing you're doing it. She was quiet a moment, then she said, "And now?" "Now I'm thinking about it as a choice," I said, "which means I still might go, but it'd be a decision, not a reflex." She looked at the lamp without speaking. But something in the room changed, some small settling quality. Like a house finding its foundation when the temperature changes and everything draws in and becomes itself more completely. After a while she said, Ida mentioned that she's thinking about slowing down in a year or two, maybe stepping back from running the house. She said she might need someone to take it on. She paused. I've been thinking about that. I think this could be a place to build something real. I think you're right, I said. I think it's a good town and you'd be good at running this place. She turned the cup in her hands. Then she looked at me and said, "Do you have any thought about where you'll be a year from now?" I had been waiting for something like this question, or something near it. When it came, I found I wasn't nervous about it the way I might have expected. I knew what I was going to say. I'd known it longer than I'd been admitting. I've been thinking, I said, that a town like this has enough work for a man who's useful with his hands. Ranch work in the warm months, building and repair when it's cold. That's what I've been thinking about. She held my eyes. That sounds practical, she said. I'm a practical man, I said. The corner of her mouth moved. I've noticed that, she said. We sat there with the lamp between us and the cold outside pressing at the walls and the sound of Ida somewhere at the back of the house. And something that had been circling for months came in and landed and folded its wings. She reached across and set her hand over mine, just a moment, warm and certain, and then she took it back and stood up. "Good night, Amos," she said. "Good night," I said. There is a kind of morning that comes in the deep of a high plains winter when the sky goes clear and still, and the cold is so absolute it almost makes a sound, and every surface is glazed with frost that catches the early light and throws it back in pieces, and you can see from one end of the world to the other with nothing blurring. Clara was already on the porch when I came out. She had a shawl pulled around her shoulders and her coffee in both hands, and she was watching the street, which was empty still in the early cold. Her breath made small, steady clouds. She didn't look over when I came out. I stood beside her with my own coffee and looked at the street. She was watching the town the way you watch something you've begun to feel responsible for, knowing its rhythms, when the butcher opened, which kids walked by at what time, the particular way the wind came off the bluff to the north and moved the sign above the hardware store. She knew all of that now. You could see it in her stillness, the easy quality of a person who knows where they are. I thought about the trail that had brought me to this particular porch on this particular morning. All the years and miles and drives and empty rooms. All the times I'd left and not looked back, told myself it was freedom, which was part true and part the story you tell yourself when the other thing is harder to say. I thought about a cedar brake and a woman in a torn white dress sitting against a tree, measuring me as one of her bad options, and how she had turned out to be right about me, because I had turned out to be an option she chose to keep. She looked over at me. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with something in her face that was plain and unguarded, not a performance of feeling but the real thing, the specific and particular way a woman looks at a man she has chosen with her own free will and clear eyes, nobody's arrangement, nothing owed. A woman who had walked off a bad road on her own 2 feet, and then, when she had the chance and the room to choose, had walked toward this. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I said. She turned back to the street. The frost was burning off the rooftops now as the sun cleared the water tower, the light coming across the boards of the porch and across her face and across my hands holding the cup. The town was starting up, a door opening here, a horse being led down the street there, a kid running with his coat half-buttoned, the ordinary motion of people going about their days. I drank my coffee, she drank hers. Her shoulder was an inch from mine, or less. The cold was real and the coffee was hot, and the sky above the rooftops was the particular pale gold that means the day is going to open up into something good. That's the whole of what I can tell you. That's where the story lands and stays. She had walked out of a bad situation on her own 2 feet, barefoot, in the dark, with nothing in her pockets and nowhere certain to go. That's a kind of courage that doesn't need explaining. And I had come around a bend in the trail and stopped, not because I'd reasoned it out or calculated anything, but because something in me had looked at her and was already decided before I knew it. And she had looked at me in that cedar break and made her own calculation, and arrived at a different answer than I'd given her reason to expect, and that answer had held all the way through to this porch. A man can be useful for a long time and never be chosen. He can be competent and reliable and hardworking and still come home, if he comes home at all, to an empty room. I had been all of those things, and I had come home to empty rooms for years, and I had told myself it didn't matter, which is what you tell yourself when you can't do anything about it. But there's a difference between being useful and being wanted, between being kept on because you're capable and being chosen because of who you are. I understand that difference now in the way you understand a thing that has been explained to you not by words, but by the thing itself arriving. She chose me, a woman with clear eyes and real grit and the kind of judgment that had been tested and not broken. A woman who had paid the price for trusting the wrong person and had then, when she could have kept everyone at a safe distance and been completely justified in it, she had walked toward me instead. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. That's the thing a man carries with him, not the rescue or the standoff in the street or the sheriff's visit or any of the rest of it. He carries the moment a good woman put her hand on his arm and said clearly, "I know what I want," and meant him. The porch boards were cold under my boots. The coffee had gone lukewarm. The sky above the water tower was full blue now, the gold gone out of it and something cleaner and larger taking its place. She stayed where she was beside me. I stayed where I was beside her. That was everything. That was, as it turned out, more than enough.